everyone, welcome back to BlenderDiplom.com. I'm Gottfried Hofmann and I'm gonna show you how to create this cool ball displacement effect you see here. It's heavily relying on dynamic paint, so the tutorial will also be a very small introduction to dynamic paint. And let me first show you how the effect is created and the general idea behind it. You see here the logo and the displacement and all those balls sticking out. And when you take a closer look at the logo and the kind of colors you see here, you might already guess that we are working with vertex groups and painting on those vertex groups. And yeah, you got it right. Here we got our vertex weight group, and it's influenced by dynamic paint, for which this cube here is gonna work as a brush. And this vertex group here will serve for a displace modifier. One second. A displace modifier and a particle system where all those balls are coming from. So you see that the cube is already been used to drive quite a lot of effects, but there is also a third effect that's going to be driven by this cube here, and that's here on the texture side of our logo. We're going to use a blend texture to fade it out just where this face of the cube is. So this cube alone drives all the advanced effects in this scene, and that's something you very often like to have in motion graphics. You want a kind of a rig where one single object drives a lot and lots of different and complicated effects, and that's what we're going to create here. We're going to create a basic motion graphics rig where one object drives 3 different effects. So this here is the starter.blend you can get on BlenderDiplom.com, and it's pretty much the same blend you will get when you do this logo to sand tutorial here. And I use this as a starting point because I don't want in this tutorial it to take ages by showing you all the steps here. So if you want to do it yourself and use your own logo, just check out this tutorial and go up to the point where you're using the remesh modifier on your mesh, because that's something very important here for this effect. We need our logo to be remeshed, so we get all those very small faces here, because later on we're going to be using a displace modifier. But first thing I'd like to change from this version is that I'd like to change the background, because later on there will be all this bubble-like displacement and balls coming and going, and I want a different geometry as a contrast to this in the background, and that's where I decided for some stripes. So let's quickly add those stripes. Let me go to the word panel, and paper sky is checked. That's all that we need. Then let me go here to textures, and here select the word icon. If you select the material icon, you will get the textures that are on the logo, but we want to change the word background, so select this icon here and let me add a new texture. Let's call it stripes and select wood. And in the preview, let me turn on both. And at the moment, you're not seeing anything, but when we change the influence to horizon and set the blending to multiply, we should see an effect. And there it is, but it's still colored with a rather pinkish color. We can change this by giving our texture some own colors, and now we start to see the effect. And from the texture above we got this vignette-like fade out at the edges. And what I now want to have is I want this effect to be by far not as strong as it is right now. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna reduce the influence to the horizon to 0.12. And now let's see how it's looking. Okay, it's looking way better. And then I'm also changing the blending type to ease, which will make these also look a little not as extreme. And I'm also changing the type from sinus to tree. And now I'd like this to be a little softer. So what I'm gonna change is here. I'm gonna removing the alpha. Actually, it's not of any use anyways on the right side, but rather here, the dark part, I'm gonna reduce it a little bit. And by reducing the dark parts, you'll also reduce the effect of the multiply onto the background. And now it's by far not as strong anymore as it was before. Now, something else I'd like to change is that I'd like those stripes not to go from top left to bottom right, but vice versa, from top right to bottom left. So let me change the mapping, and if I change the size in X from 1 to -1, they will be mirrored. On the X direction, yeah, it worked. And now something I'd like to do is also I'd like to change the offset a bit so it's becoming animated. And let me first set the correct end frame for our animation. I want it to end on frame 210, and the main animation inside I'd like to end at frame 175. So that's also where I'd like the background to stop moving. So let me insert a keyframe now by hitting I. Now let me go to frame 1. And since I wanted to move from right to left, let me change the offset to a negative value, -0.5. So let's hit I now, and now let's check somewhere in the middle whether it's moving. So, and yeah, it's slightly moving from right to left. So we got a very subtle background pattern now that's gonna move very, very slowly from right to left, while our balls will come from left to right. So there's a small contrast coming from the background, which will add just a little bit of touch to our scene, and that's the very first thing I'd like to do. So to show you the basics of dynamic paint, I've created a few objects on another layer. It's a cube and a plane that is heavily subdivided. The idea of dynamic paint is to use one mesh and paint on another. So let's do this. You can turn on dynamic paint for any mesh here in physics, dynamic paint, and then you have to select whether it is a canvas or a brush. Let me select brush for the cube and canvas for the plane, and you already see something has happened here. Right at the cube there's this blue stripe. And now let me turn on wire display for the cube, not the plane, for the cube, and we see what's going on. Obviously the cube is painting onto the plane, and when I move it around you see it's updating live. Pretty cool, eh? And you can do quite a lot of things with dynamic paint. Let me show you just a few. For example, if we on the canvas change the surface type from paint to displace, the cube is displacing the plane. Pretty cool, right? Or let me show you this here, waves. It's also pretty cool. If you're doing the animation now, you see that dynamic paint also has a kind of wave or water simulation integrated. So you can do quite a lot of things. Way too many to show them all in this tutorial, and that's why I'm gonna focus on weight painting through dynamic paint. And you see here already, now when I'm moving the cube, I can dynamically change the weight painting of our plane. That's really, really awesome because we can have animated weights. And let me show you a few options before we start on the text. When I select the cube, under dynamic paint source, I can change how the cube is affecting the plane. For example, if I switch from mesh volume to mesh volume plus proximity, you see that outside of the mesh we got a fall off, and that's already pretty cool because it's smoothly falling off from 1, that's 100%, to 0%, that's blue. And that's actually pretty much what we want here, but we want it a little different. So let me switch to proximity, And now we got the effect that we want. We had no effect, then it becomes stronger, maximum effect, and then it's becoming less again until it's completely faded out. The other options you got here is object center, which will ignore any geometry and just use the origin of our object for this effect, which is also pretty useful. And then we also got particle system, which is doing the same as object center but with particles. Now let me go back to proximity and show you one effect of dynamic paint. Let me just animate this. Yeah, of course, if we got something dynamic, we should of course animate it. And now let's let the cube move over the plane. And even though it's set to proximity, it's completely red in the middle. What's happening? Well, of course, that's because it's a brush. It's just painting over our plane, and if it's reaching 100% here at the edge, of course it will stay 100%, just like paint. So that's of course not what we want, because we like to have our effect become stronger, and then fade out. So we can easily fix this by selecting at our plane or at our canvas, fade. So let's see what this is doing. And now it's fading out, but still not exactly like we wanted. So let me put this to 1. And now let's check it out again. Perfect, exactly what we want. And now the idea is to create just a very big cube around our text object, make the text object the canvas, turn on fade, and everything will be alright. So let's first create the brush. Let's hit Shift A, add Mesh Cube. And first thing I'm gonna do is turn on Wire Display, and then go into the side view and move it up a little. And now I'm gonna make it considerably larger, because I want later on the paint effect to be 4 Blender units wide. So we have to make it 4 Blender units large in all directions. So let me hit S and Y, and 1, 2, 3, 4, plus a little bit for the text, because the 4 Blender units from here shouldn't touch the text, because otherwise it will paint onto these parts of the text. Now the same thing for the Z-axis, S, Z, and 1, 2, 3, 4, plus a little bit. Okay, now for the X-axis, let me first go into edit mode, select this face here, and now I want to change the origin. So Shift S, cursor to selected, go back to object mode, and search for set origin. And now let's say origin to 3D cursor. What we are now able to do is we can just move this up until this part is 4 Blender units away from the last end of the M. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we can simply scale it on the S-axis into the other direction. SX. And here it's also 1, 2, 3, 4. And here we got our brush. Let me add some dynamic paint to it. Add not canvas, brush, add brush. Set it to proximity and the paint distance to 4. So that's all for now. And now let's select the logo. Also give it dynamic paint, but this time it's gonna be a canvas. The end frame already is perfect at 210. And something else that should be added is anti-aliasing to add a little bit more quality to our effect. And now set the surface type to weight and the fade to 1 second, just as we did. And now let's see whether we'll have any effect on this. Or let's better first animate it before we check on the effect. So let's go once again to frame 175, hit I, location. Then let's go into frame 1 and move it into the X direction up until there is no more. It is four blender units away from the B, so we don't see any more influence on it. So about here, I, location, and now when we let it move through, we see the effect on the BlenderDiplom on the logo. And one thing we can still change, I think, is the effect of the fall off of our brush. At the moment it's set to smooth, which is already pretty cool, but I like the red part to be a little stronger and longer, broader, without changing the overall breadth of our paint effect. So let me change it to color ramp, and let's keep it like it is, but change it from linear to ease. And now if you go to frame 1 and move it over, we see it's a lot more red there, and that's because ease means the fall off is more like an S-curve. So it's strong for a very long time, then it's going down very fast, and then the fade out also takes a very long time. So this is exactly what I want. And yeah, we've set up the dynamic paint part so far. Now let me bake this, because I want the data for our simulation to stay fit. And also I'd like to create an output for our simulation data. And that's of course a vertex group. We can just hit the plus sign here. And now after the baking, all the data will be read directly into the vertex group, and we can use this for our cool effects. So let me hit bake and see you. After baking, if you scrub through the timeline and select your canvas, you'll see this pinkish line down here, and that means on each of all of those frames there is baked simulation data. It will be read directly from the cache if we scrub through, and thus things are now very fast and also very secure, because the simulation won't change anymore as long as it's baked and fixed. So now we can add all those cool effects. Let me start with the displacement. That's of course done by a displace modifier. And if you just add the displace modifier, all the text will be displaced along its normal, which, yeah, it also looks, but I don't think it looks cool. So let me first choose a new texture, and then as a vertex group the dynamic paint weight. And now you already see where this is going. But what I'd like to change here is the texture we got here. I'd like to edit it so it's a different one. And in Blender Internal, that's a little bit confusing how to edit this texture for the displace modifier, because we need first to go to materials, select any of these materials, and then towards to texture. Let me select the red one, texture. Here we need to add a new texture, but select it from this list here, and here this texture.001, that's our texture we just added to the displace modifier. So let me call it displace, and select a different pattern first, or a different type. And I'd like some Voronoi, because that's what's giving those bubble-like effect. And I don't want it to be this strong, so I'm going the lazy way this time and just select B-spline here, which will greatly reduce the contrast by making the part down here not completely white but rather grayish, and this part won't be completely black but also very dark gray. So now for the texture itself, let me make it a little bigger, and we're already seeing the effect. Let me also turn off the color here, because otherwise this would affect the color of our logo, and also turn off this here. So we are totally sure that this texture won't affect any shading of our logo. And yeah, settings are all fine. Let's go back towards the displace modifier. And at the moment you see that the bubbles are pointing inwards, but I want them to point outwards, and we can easily fix this by making the strength negative. So let me say minus 1.5, and now you see the effect of those bubbles in our text, and here it's quite extreme, but that's okay. Let me just render this so we can see the effect. And yeah, I forgot to turn off the renderability of the dynamic paint brush. So here's our brush, turn off the renderability, and now we got our displace effect with those bubbles, which is already looking pretty cool, but I'd like it to fade out. So let me quickly show you how to work on the fade out. And let me first go more towards the middle of the blender part. The blender part has a material, and we can simply turn on transparency here and turn the alpha down to 0. Now of course it's completely gone, but if we create a texture that's going to influence the alpha, this will change. Let me select blend and call the texture fade. And let's not fade it from right to left, but from left to right. You can simply change this by selecting colors, ramp, and hit F for flip. And I'd also like it to be ease once again. It will just look better. And now let's turn off alpha under influence, but turn off color under influence and rather choose alpha. And now let's see how this is looking. We see a kind of fade effect, but it's not at the point of the strongest part of the displacement where I'd like it. But in Blender Internal we can easily change this by changing the mapping towards object, which will mean now the object we're going to select, and I'm going to select the controller, will project its coordinates onto our other mesh, and thus we can have a very good control over the place where the fading will take effect. Let me just take a look at how this is looking now, and something's changed again, but it's still not what I want, because I want it to be at a very small location on our logo, on our small part of the logo, and currently it's going over a very big part. And the reason for this is in the dimension of our object here, or not in the dimension, in the scale, because this object input will now use the entire scale of our big object for mapping the textures, and we see it's got a scale of 10 in x directions. That is like half of the dimensions of 20, so this is so big, and that's the part where the fading will take place, and of course that's way too big. But we can easily fix this by resetting the scale. Let me hit Ctrl A and say apply scale, and now magically the scale has changed to 1, 1, 1 without changing the dimensions of our object. It's still the same object here in 3D view. And now if I hit render, the fading should take place in a part that's just one Blender unit wide, and that's exactly what I want. But now, if I go to a part where the dark part of the BlenderDiplom is, there is no fade out effect. And that's because it's got a different material, and for each material we have to set up the texture. So let's select the same texture, and now let's hit render again, and you will see a very interesting effect. Once again, it's just fading in over the entire part here, and that is because when you use the same texture on two different materials, it will also only keep the colors and the blend type, but not the mapping and the influence. So first of all, turn on alpha here, and let's also select the object, our controller, and now things should be fine. Let me go more towards this part and it's not fine. That's because we forgot to turn on transparency on our object. So alpha 0, test again, and yes, perfect. Next thing is the particles. Before I'm gonna add the particle system, let me first add an object we're gonna use for the particle system. So let me go to another layer, cursor to center, and add a UV sphere. Let me first turn on smooth, and now let's give this some materials. Let me first add one new material. The diffuse color is already okay. It's not completely white, but rather somehow grayish, which is already pretty good. And let's first change the specularity, and I'd like it to be ward ISO because that's very, very sharp. Then shading, no transparency, but let's turn on mirror to give it some reflectivity of the other balls around them. And I'd like it to have some Fresnel effect. You can see it up here, but the Fresnel will make the parts of the sphere that are pointing towards the camera less reflective than the edges. So mostly the edges will reflect the other balls, which will look pretty cool. So now let me also add another material. Let me first call this ball.white. And here I'm gonna select the ball.white, but I'm gonna hit this little 2 here, because this will make a single user out of it, so we can actually change it without changing the original material. But this now has a complete copy of all the settings, so we only need to change the diffuse. And I'm gonna do this once again because I want the ball to have stripes. So once again, first hit a little 2, then let me rename it. Oh, what's happening here? This should be ball.black, and now here ball.red, and this one is gonna have a very darkish red material, so maybe this kind, and it's got all the settings. But now our ball still looks the same. We got 3 material slots, but only 1 material assigned to the ball, so let's assign the rest. Let me go to edit mode, hit A to deselect everything, go to front view, and now I want to select all these 2 rings here with Alt and Shift. I can select the entire rings, and let me assign the black material, and down here these 2 rings with R, Shift, Alt, and now let me assign the red material, and this is it. We got our particle for the logo. So now let me select the logo and add a particle system to it, but let's first change the name here, because we'll need to select it later on in the particle system. So now let me add the particle system plus, and let me change it from emitter to hair, and that's quite a lot of hair. Let me reduce it to a number of 35, and also turn on advanced. And now first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to add the object to it. So let's go to render, object, and select our balls.stripe and turn off the scale. So only our particle system will change the scale. And now we got all those small balls sticking to our logo, which is already pretty cool. But I like them to be bigger at first. And we can change the size. Up here under velocity, a higher velocity of the hair will actually just change the size of our objects. So 4 is a good start, and also some randomness. So a random size of 2. But now the entire logo is full of those balls, and I want them to show up just where our dynamic paint is working. So let me go down to vertex groups 1 again, and under length select dp.weight, and now they are big where our dynamic paint is strong, and becoming smaller and smaller the less influence of our dynamic paint we have. That's of course perfect. Now one thing I'd also like to see is I'd like to have balls distributed around our balls here, and we can do this by adding children. And we should add simple children, because I don't want complicated ones. Just simple ones. So let me first change the most important settings. You see I've turned the number down to 5. That means for each particle we got here, for each hair, we get 5 children. And now if I change the radius, the children will be distributed farther away from them, and 2.5 is a good value here. And also a little bit of roundness, so they are distributed spherical around our parent particles. And now let me change a little bit of the other stuff. First of all, let's give them a random size. And let's also turn on the clumping, but let's have them a shape of clumping outwards. And now what I want to do is I also want to influence the clumping by our weight painting through the dynamic paint, and this will give them some small movement while the dynamic paint object is moving across the logo, which is very important. All the other stuff will just change the distribution a little bit. I found those settings here I'm giving you pretty good, like endpoint of 0.25 and a random rough of 3 and size of the random rough of 1.4. So now we got all the settings here, and now let's take a look at the distribution from inside our camera. Because right now at this point all of those particles are showing their backside, that's the red ring, and I don't think this is looking pretty cool. So let's change up here the seed value and see if we get another distribution. And this one looks pretty cool because we see both the black and the red rings. Let me scrub through this and see if it's cool at the entire part. No, here at the end the balls are distributed around our logo, but we want so thus you would see the fade out effect, which is, or the fade in effect, which is not cool. So let me see whether we got a seed where they are in front and somewhat well distributed. Yeah, this is good. They are showing both rings, and they are in front at the end. So let me see whether they are in front all the time. Yeah, and now we got a pretty cool effect. And now let's move on towards the rendering. So let's see how this is looking here, and let me render it, because you might already notice one thing I'd like to add is small bright dots as a specularity, and we can easily add those by adding lamps. So let me simply add an area lamp. So lamp area, and rotate it upwards towards those balls, and I also like it to shine from there where the camera is pointing towards those balls. And now let's see, you see 7, if we can rotate it a lot more to them. Perfect. Call this area.left, and let's select the settings. I don't want him to influence the diffuse, because this way they would shine onto the logo too, and it wouldn't look good on the balls. I just want to influence the specular. And let's also reduce the distance quite a bit, so dots that are balls that are nearer towards the lamp will have a brighter dots than balls that are farther away. And something I'd also like to turn on is ray shadow, so if a ball is in front of another one, the second ball doesn't also get a reflection or a specular highlight. Now let's just escape, duplicate this. Yeah, no, Shift D should be duplicated at some point, and let's move it upwards so it's pointing actually down onto those balls, and move it right there, looking pretty good. Now let's just change the name of this, because if everything is named well and you 1 year later you reopen your blend file, you'll see what everything is doing, so always keep decent names. And let's see how things are looking. and we can see the first specular highlights, and it's looking pretty cool now. Thanks to those specular highlights, we also see the reflections a little better, and here you also see the effect of the Fresnel, that we got no reflections coming from where the camera is looking at, but lots of reflections around the edges. And we got on this side at the edge we got some specular highlights, and on this side coming from the left also very nice specular highlights. Something else I'd like to change is that I'd also like the logo to mirror the balls. So let's select the logo again, go to the material, let me select the red material and turn on mirror, and here I'd like to have a little more reflectivity, 0.4 should be good. And now let's see whether this is making any difference. By hitting F11, this will bring up your last saved render. Then I'm gonna select another render slot. Now if I hit F12, our last render won't be overwritten, it will still be saved in slot number 5. And we can now take a look whether anything has changed. Here we got how things are looking in render slot number 6. And if I change now to slot number 5, we can see the difference. And mainly the BlenderDiplom got a little darker because we got our sky here, which will also change which will also add the effect of the parts in the sky that are moving, which will also add them towards our logo here. And let's see whether we are seeing any mirrorings of the balls. Here, for example, the ball is mirrored, and in slot number 5 it's gone. So this will also add a little bit of realism, and it will also just look cooler. But now I'd like everything to be a little brighter, the entire scene. So let's go towards the environment lighting. It's also already at 1. So let me see if we add some ambient occlusion, if this will make the stuff brighter again. And yeah, things are a lot brighter again, but what happened to those balls? Oh, I guess I must have moved in the timeline, so we can't really compare this directly this time, but just by looking at the scene. And yeah, things have become a lot brighter again since the ambient occlusion is added on top, and we got very clear, strong, good reflections. Everything is looking pretty cool. So now let's head over towards the compositing. But before we go to compositor, let me show you something. Right now the small children balls are moving around the parent balls. See, for example this one, how it's changing its position. The reason for this is because we got the displace modifier above the particle system, and the parent balls, they are more or less stick to the surface, so they are not moving a lot, but the children, which are far away, are moving quite a bit to this displacement. And so, if you got moving stuff, it would be of course cool to have some motion blur. So let me turn on vector in the layers, because this will allow us to add cheap fake motion blur in the compositor. So let's switch to compositing, turn on use nodes and backdrop, and also shift control left clicked this render layer to add a viewer node. And now let me also add down here UV image editor and down here viewer node, so we can move this around and see what's happening with this ball. Let's first add the vector blur. It's under filter, vector blur. And now a cool trick, this vector blur image has kind of a lot of inputs, and if you shift select the render layers and hit F 3 times, all those inputs are filled magically. But now let's connect it with the viewer node, but unfortunately we cannot see anything because we don't have any motion vectors computed yet. First we need to hit F12 once to render once again. And now we see here calculating next frame vectors, calculating next frame vectors. That's the data the vector blur node is gonna fed with, and that's the data that's coming out of the speed output. Now let's see what's happening with this small ball here when the vector blur is added. and see, it's blurred because it's moving. And let's increase the quality by upping the samples up to 64, and let's increase the quality once again a bit by selecting curve, which will mean if this one is moving on a curved scale, then the blur will be curved. And I see nothing has changed here, so maybe the curved option wasn't that important anyway, but it's not really taking any much computing time, so you can actually always have it checked. So now I'd like to change just a very few things. I'd like to add some color corrections with RGB curves and see if I can change stuff a little bit to make this look better. Oh, this is looking a little overbright, but let's see if I increase the contrast. Yeah, this is looking pretty cool now with some increased contrast, mainly in the areas that are brighter. Yeah, now pretty cool effect, vignette effect around there, and pretty nice colors over everywhere. So this is about finished. Let me just add one last finishing touch under distort, lens distortion, and let me add some dispersion, but not as extreme as you see it here, because that actually looks kinda ugly. Let's reduce the effect so it's just barely noticeable to 0.01. And now we got a very subtle effect around the edges with about this lens distortion, while everything else is undistorted, which is looking pretty cool. And last thing I want to do, I'd like to select the output of our last node and connect it to the composite node, because otherwise our render output wouldn't see any of the composite. So now it's finished, we can render the animation out. But first of all, I'd like to tell you a small thing about this effect, because it's actually two effects in one. Right now you see this motion blur here because the children are moving around the parents. That's because, as I already told you, we have moved the particle system under the displace modifier. If you don't want this active movement and just want those balls to become bigger and smaller and move just a very little, you can turn the particle system on top of the displace modifier. And that's actually the effect you've seen in the intro. And for the outro, I'm going to show you how the effect is looking if the particle system is below the displace modifier. So actually, by simply switching the positions of the modifier, you will get a completely different intro, and this will should also show you the versatility of this effect. So now for the outro, the same effect but with the particle system below the displace modifier. And I hope you've learned something with this tutorial, and I hope you liked the effect. Maybe if you are creating something cool with this tutorial, it would be cool if you would show up on, or if you would show it to me on BlenderDiplom.com down in the comments. I'm always eager to see what you are doing with this effect. And also, if you like something about this tutorial or dislike anything about it, just go to the comments and leave a comment. I'm also open for criticism, because without criticism I cannot improve. So have fun and happy blending.